My name is Alex Schweder, and I'm not based on this coast. I'm becoming more and more familiar with LA. I taught here maybe 10 years ago at SciArc, and so Los Angeles is a pretty special place for me because it's where I first started formulating a lot of ideas that I have about performance and architecture. And I'm going to talk a little, that's going to be the sort of thrust of my conversation today. So performance architecture, it's a kind of question really, and it ties, it's a nice segue from Andrea's last presentation about wind. This is a recent project called Reactor, which is a house that's balanced on a single point, on a single column, and it kind of tilts with the weight of people within it, so it requires two people to live in the house itself, and then it also spins around in the wind. Just sort of randomly. It doesn't generate any sort of power or anything, but it just kind of blows around and around. So, you know, when someone sees something like this, which is a thing that looks architectural, and it moves, and, you know, there are people who are activating it, you know, that's one thing to give an image to something called performance architecture. But what really is performance architecture? Here's another view of Reactor. The first three shots are going to be of Reactor. And that's a kind of a good question. It's a term that I came up with to describe what I do. It's a term that led me down the path of a PhD, which then sort of, through doing that work of having to write about my own practice, really challenged me to define what it is that I'm doing, right? And it requires you, when you do a PhD, of course, you have to argue that what you're doing is contributing to knowledge, and what is knowledge? And in my PhD is at Cambridge in the UK, and there's a methodology that's developing called arts-based methodology, which is something I'm going to talk a little bit about today. It's a way of researching for artists. And the best answer that I've come up with to the question of what is performance architecture, it's actually just a way of questioning through environments. And I was originally attracted to the term performance architecture because of the history of performance art, which I see as really people using performance and performance art history to think about everyday life. Like, that's what performance artists can do really well, is kind of think about everyday life as a way of kind of activated thinking. And everyday life happens within architecture all the time. I mean, that's what a building is for. It kind of provides a platform or a set of instructions or a stage for everyday things to happen through. But architects don't generally think in the way that performance artists do, right? There's a different way of thinking. There's a way of thinking, and I'm going to show this Better Shelter, which was developed, I guess, finalized in 2015 as part of IKEA's answer to shelter for refugees, right? So it's very fast, it's very inexpensive, and you can provide a lot of them. So this typifies one way of questioning in architecture. I'd say a kind of quantitative way of questioning. There are three kind of types of methodologies for building knowledge, right? And this is the one that's most closely associated with science, which is the quantitative. And the answers to these questions come out in numbers, right? So we use numbers. So that's a kind of expression of knowledge through architecture. Another question that we can ask through this home, through this place to live, or what are the characteristics of homes? So I would say this is a kind of more qualitative way of asking questions through buildings, right? Like, what does it mean what are the qualities of home? Well, it's got this kind of pitched roof, and it's got a front door, and it's got these little windows, and it seems cozy, right? I mean, it looks like this not because this is the best, cheapest, most readily available. I mean, it is those things. It doesn't resist that. But, you know, I think that this was designed from a particular image, right? It's an image of home. So these are qualities. This is a, you know, so that's something that we might answer with words, right? So this type of knowledge, what are the characteristics of home, or something you might describe. The questioning that I'm most interested in through architecture is who will I become through living there? And this, I would say, is the kind of knowledge or the kind of question whose answers are best given in embodiment, right? This is what artists often do, is they embody things, and they transfer knowledge through embodiment, whether that's through a dance performance or an installation that you walk into and you experience in a kind of multisensory way. So my identifying these three ways of thinking or asking questions, or the types or the ways that we might answer questions, it's presented as, in a sense, discrete here. There are three different things, but they're all focusing around one object, right? So the commonality is our built environment, and oftentimes these questions and these answers are imbricated, right? They're tied together. They're not these kind of separate things as I've talked about them here, but they're actually informing each other in a more dynamic way that changes the other, right? So it's not this kind of separate thing. But for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to focus on this last kind of questioning where answers are given in an embodied way. So I came up with this idea, this term of performance architecture in 2007. I wasn't the only one to do this in this year. There's a curator out there named Pedro Gadano, who was at the MoMA. He came up with this term around that time too, also kind of drawing from the history of performance art to think about architecture. And anyway, but we're, like many discoveries, like many new ideas, they happened simultaneously at the same time in different parts of the world. He was in Portugal, I was in, I don't know where I was that year. I was somewhere. Maybe I don't know where I was actually. For part of the year I was in this project called Flatland, which is a 2-foot wide building that we built at the Sculpture Center in New York City. I lived there with 5 other people. There were 6 total, and the idea came from a science fiction novel, which you guys are probably all familiar with. And moving into this piece, I had ideas. I had been working with the idea of how to think about our time-based bodies through buildings, by making buildings also time-based, right? Like, buildings can be a kind of effigy in a way of almost a mirror for who we would like to be, right? If you think of the history of architecture being symmetrical and time and invulnerable to the effects of time, like it's always going to be there. So we think about our bodies, and I'm much more interested in the body that I have than the body that I want. It's a kind of richer experience. More complicated for sure. So we all moved in here, and I had this idea, okay, here's this really tiny building. Here's this sliver of a building. It's only 2 feet wide. There are 16 square feet per person to live in for 3 weeks. That's not very much. There's a bathroom with hot and cold running water and a kitchen. And I had the idea that what would happen would be that this building would become like an old shoe, right? Where you put on a shoe and it's new, and then you walk in it for a while and it starts to deform and bulge and show your hammer toe and do all that stuff. And I thought that the same thing would happen to this building, where it's so tight that the pressure within it would start to deform the exterior of it, and thereby sort of evidencing what was going on inside of it through a change in material form on the outside. What actually happened inside here was we could never meet as a group. right? Because think about it, like if it's 2 feet wide, like Robert and I could only talk to each other, and maybe I could talk to the woman behind him, but I couldn't talk to Oberon, who's right back there, who's right behind her. And it would be kind of like we couldn't have a group meeting, so we broke up into two groups, the chaos people and the order people, right? And the chaos people kind of moved. They went to the free art supplies depot in New York City, and they got all this stuff like carpets and bric-a-brac, and they put it all in there, 16 square feet, and then they didn't know what to do. They didn't know what they wanted to make. It's just like, oh, I'm just gonna kind of get a bunch of stuff and I'll figure out what to make out of it, but it's free, so it's in here now. But then there was really no more room for them, so they would come and hang out in the kitchen, and they would leave like coffee cups around, and then the coffee cup would get kicked, and I was on the bottom. I'm a leak expert as well. I was trained as an architect. This is just a little aside. I was trained as an architect, so I was tasked with designing the bathroom, and so I thought, okay, well, to convince everyone of my confidence in this bathroom, I'll live right underneath it. So anyway, but that put me at the very bottom, and when a coffee cup would get kicked, I would have coffee. So anyway, that's the most interesting thing about Flatland, is actually the story of what happened to people and who did we become through this building, and it was because of the building that we became that. So there's this kind of tie between space and subject that became really, really interesting to me. This is a kind of discovery that I made. I met a fellow named Ward Shelley, who's at the top of this next project called In Orbit, and this is one that we did in Brooklyn as well. Ward and I also made Reactor together. We've been working together for the last 10 years, and we have a couple of projects going on this year as well, which I'll tell you about just briefly. Anyway, so Ward and I started making these buildings where the relationship that the building not only is supposed to house, but in a sense produce, is immediately visible when you walk in, right? When you walk into the gallery, you think, oh my God, here are two guys on this wheel. This one we lived in for, I think, 10 days. We don't leave at all. And that's part of this. It's part of the way that we answer a question. I mean, we're not doing these things as a kind of endurance. Oh, can we live in this weird environment for 10 days? But there's some sort of knowledge that emerges in an embodied way that we can't get to in words or numbers, but we can only get to through experience. And in An Orbit, the thing that we thought we were going to do when we went in was cooperate, right? We're going to just show, what does it mean to live in a building that requires cooperation? And it's a good question, right? But that's not actually the answer that we got, because there was a different question that emerged, which had to do with caretaking. So you see Ward up there, he's living on the top of this wheel for 10 days, and I'm living on the bottom, and I have a fear of heights, and Ward doesn't. So he's willing to kind of be up there, but it's a lot more precarious. And so my role was really to make sure that wheel moved slowly enough for Ward not to just kind of go away, right? And so this work became about caretaking in a much more personal sense. Ward and I both have experience as caretakers for our parents, and I think that there's something about autobiographic information that seeps its way, something that the artist embodies just through living a life, in some way or another, presents itself, and you come to discover parts of yourself through the works that you make, right? So again, this is about knowledge building, and through doing this PhD, I really have thought about my work differently as productive of knowledge, but it's knowledge that is not generated through numbers or words, but through embodied experience, which I think we've seen a lot of here today. And it's super exciting to see the works of people whose practices I was not as familiar with. So this is in orbit. I'll just close with those couple of shots. This is one that we're working on this year. It's called Your Turn. It's gonna, there's, again, autobiographic experience about walls. Kind of comes in, and I'll live on one side of the wall, Ward will live on the other side of the wall for 10 days. And we'll pass our different things back and forth. So we'll pass the bathroom back and forth. One guy gets to sleep while the other guy has to figure something else out. There's a kitchen and all that. So we'll be living in that for 10 days. Anyway, that brings me to another vein of performance architecture, where this last group of projects that I showed you was really about my own discovery. Like there are discoveries that I'm making by building these things, and I'm learning, and things are becoming apparent through these kind of extreme living environments, or these kind of caricatures of architectural situations. And in 2009, I moved to Berlin for a while, and I didn't have my studio, I didn't have my wood shop, I just really had not much. So the work needed to become more immaterial, but that lined up well with the question that I was interested in of how far can I push this idea that architecture is a performance, right? How performative is architecture? Can I renovate someone's house was really the question, by not changing anything other than the way that they use it. So I hung a sign in a gallery in Berlin, and I offered free architectural advice. And people would come in for kind of a conversation, and I'm still doing this work. This is the work for my dissertation that I've written about, and that's why I'm becoming a doctor, because that's what doctors do. Right, so there's a in one way, this work that I've done has been very, very rich personally and intellectually, but there's a tongue-in-cheek aspect to it as well, where I'm kind of appropriating the moniker of doctor as the scientist to kind of gain a kind of authority in these projects that I then return to the person with whom I'm working. It's not me. It's never me telling anyone what to do. It's really other people kind of feeling the permission in the presence of an authority for them to make up their own minds. That's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. So we talk about an apartment. We'll kind of chat about something. This is one of the very earliest works that I've done. It's with a collector named Bill True in Seattle, in whose new architect design house he finds it difficult to display little artworks.
It's a wonderful place to live. What struck me about what you said just a few minutes ago is that it's always filled with people. Mm-hmm. Always. It's very unusual that it's not. The cast of characters stay the base 15 people who are in and out of the house are pretty set, and then there are always, and it's mostly the art world, artists coming, curators coming, friends from out of town coming, staying with us. Ruthie usually puts them to work doing something, either cooking or putting something together, or they're put into the motion, put into the fray, and thrown into it. Which is why William Kentridge was so interesting, because that's just not what he does or did, nor did we feel natural asking him, because that's not who he was. So.
Yeah. A home, at least I think in the way a lot of people understand a home, and the way that a home is performed, is it's that place to kind of retreat. It's a place to kind of step back from an intensity, and is that I'm kind of curious how that plays out for you.
Well, I think that there's a couple rooms in the house that I think of as mine, that I can retreat to. Sometimes in the middle of a lot of activity, I'll just retreat to a private room and close the door very little need to do that.
Yeah.
But for me, I sometimes just need to pull back from all that activity and
Yes.
retreat.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that I struggle with still is how to, which is a good thing for me, but is how to live with art in the house.
Uh-huh.
The house is so, as I said, it's so overwhelming in some ways that the idea of how you put art in it, how you live with art in it, what certain walls mean with this design is still a challenge to me.
Yeah.
Coming up on 2 years, which I think is kind of exciting.
Yeah. Yeah.
As opposed to a house that retreats.
Right. Right.
It doesn't retreat. It's always challenging. So,
Right.
So go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah.
Take me on.
So this being one of the first few renovations I did was much different than the way I practice now, but I'm showing this kind of, through 3 renovations, I'll show a kind of evolution of an approach. So for Bill, you know, we had this conversation and then I went away and I thought about something that was kind of what I thought would be, you know, interesting and clever and something that might open his eyes. And it talks about the role of the artist or the role of the, let's call them just the questioner, right? Me being the questioner, the scientist is a questioner. You know, how does that person see themselves in relationship to those with whom they work? Is it someone who has the answer and then says what is, or is it something wherein you work with those with whom you work to kind of go back and forth? Is there this kind of critical reflection that occurs between 2 people that allows different thoughts to emerge, and that's kind of where the thinking has gone. But, you know, I wasn't trained as an artist, so I had ideas about what an artist did, and that's someone who is very clever and would tell people clever things to do. And anyway, my clever thing for Bill, and I'm really happy with his work still, was just to basically take his, with the, you know, with the idea that he was finding it challenging to hang subtle works of art in his home. My renovation of his house was to walk through his house looking at white painted walls, understanding them as a painting. And so we walked, you know, through his house, just kind of connecting walls until there are no more walls to connect, and seeing sort of subtle changes in light as the kind of interest of the painted surface, right? So it's all paint, but it's just a house paint. At any rate, yeah. So I'm gonna end Bill's painting there. I also sort of described I gave instructions for these performances, for these renovations in a very different way. I would, again, taking perhaps the idea of a doctor to a step too far, I would write out prescriptions for people and then hand them out, but it was all very tongue-in-cheek and not very engaging. So I started to think about, well, what have other artists done? What have other performance artists done to kind of communicate and replicate performances? So I thought of the work of Lynn Hirschmann, who's now Lynn Hirschmann-Leeson. And she did this great project called Roberta Brightmore, where she invented this alter ego to go out and meet people for something, she took an ad in the classifieds renting section asking for someone to meet her in an ambiguous relationship between are you a roommate, are you a date? Wasn't really clear. And it got so challenging in terms of the response, the amount of response, that she had to hire actresses to become Roberta and play her part. So she made these great photographs telling people how to become Roberta. I'm going to skip over one of the renovations and just go to the second one. This is sort of at the end of, the one that I'm skipping over is called Rented Milk, wherein I put myself through this renovation project process. It was a kind of self-portrait. Anyway, but I'm going to jump to OK Boyfriend because I know we're a little tight on time. This is a renovation that I did for a friend of mine, Mandy, who's a performance artist in Berlin. And I met Mandy, she heard about the work that I was doing, and she said, you know, I just moved into this flat, I don't have enough, it's a great room, it's like $200 a month, we're in Berlin, so things are less expensive there. And I don't have more money for a studio, so I need to use this room for a studio. Can you help me renovate this place so that I can use it as a studio? I'm like, okay, that's wonderful. I'm happy to work with you, but you know that we're not making any physical changes. She said, I know. So we got to work, and I asked her about, well, what is your practice about? She said, well, I'm a performance artist, and I'm making work, performance works where I'm exploring femininity as an act of endurance. Like, part of being a woman is to endure something. So she was looking at suffragists and other women through history. So we came up with this kind of set of poses that she would sort of durationally endure inside of her room as a way of thinking about that. But they seemed very derivative and a bit trite to both of us. So I then changed the question to, what are you enduring architecturally in this room? And without hesitation, she said, oh, this loft. It's so poorly made. All I can use it, I can't sleep up there. All I can use it for is like throwing crap in suitcases. She said, and I guess that's kind of useful and a good thing because we need a big closet. But, this loft is like a boyfriend who's just okay. So sometimes he'll pick you up from the airport, and other times you roll over and think, are you still here? So that's a really interesting way of thinking about architecture and thinking about space and the kind of subjective stories that you might map onto space. So the title of the piece became then Okay Boyfriend. And so there are two ways you can renovate a boyfriend who's just okay. You can either make them a little worse or a little better, and it's easier to make them worse. So we made Okay Boyfriend a little worse by taking all the rubbish that she had stored at the back of the loft, moved it forward to form a wall. And she lived with that for a couple of weeks, and then she wrote me an email saying, that living with Okay Boyfriend was great for a couple of weeks. I really liked the way the reflections were in the windows. It seemed like there was change and that things could happen differently. But I now feel about it the way you might feel when your first date, the guy chews food a little bit funny and it's kind of cute. But then 2 weeks later, you're just like, shut your mouth. Like, just don't chew with it open. And I feel like that now, so I'm hitting reset on this. And so she moved everything back, put it back to the way it was, lived with it for another couple of weeks and said, Alex, it's just really gnawing at me. I through this process, I see that I really want a boyfriend. Like, I'm 28, I've never had this like long-term thing, this long-term connection with someone. It scares the hell out of me. So I think the next step of this renovation is going to be for me to find a performer and be my boyfriend for a year. So she was looking for this person to become the boyfriend, and the terms got a little strange, like, would we have sex? Would we, what if we really fall in love? Would we, like, what are the terms? And it was too complicated. Anyway, so she never did enter into that direct of a performance with the boyfriend, but during that time she met a mentor, a dramaturg, a very famous director in Poland named Andrzej. And Mandy started doing some things for Andrzej, helping him, taking him on walks, and he hired her to do these things, and they became closer and closer. They established a real friendship, and then ultimately decided that he wanted to be married when he died, and she wanted to practice being married. So they got married. They got married in New York, and I was one of the witnesses. And she now, the sort of full circle of her renovation is that she's, and they don't have sex. That's not something that either of them expect from the relationship. So she lives at his house doing a kind of very normative routine thing, which helps her out a lot, structures her life, but then she keeps her place with the loft for weekends where she can be a little bit of a freer self, someone who is 28, right, as opposed to 85. So anyway, I hope this kind of gives a sense of different types of knowledge and different ways of questioning, and the ways in which perhaps there can be some resonance between ways of questioning. So thank you all very much. Do we have time for questions?